Alright guys, this is what we had on the board as a class opener. Let's actually go through this. If we take a look at this first one, it's not even an equation. What's the absolute value of -3? It's simply +3. If we look at the next one, we're thinking, how are we going to do this? Well, you have to do the absolute value first. The absolute value of -2 is +2. And then, of course, you bring down the 3 and the minus sign. And 3 take away 2, final answer is 1. No problem. Okay. Let's get to the actual fun stuff, solving absolute value equations and inequalities. Well, we need to know these notes right here. These notes right here. Step 1 to solving an absolute value equation is to isolate the absolute value. Now, what does that mean, isolate the absolute value? Is this absolute value by itself? Is there a 2 out here and outside of the absolute values? Is there a +3? Or anything on the outside of the absolute values? And the answer is no, it is isolated. So we actually get to move on to step 2. What is step 2? Set up the positive and negative situations. So this is where we have to be very careful when we set up the positive and negative situations. When we set up the positive situation, we're simply going to rewrite it exactly the way it is without the absolute value sticks or absolute value signs. Positive situation, it's going to be x plus 2 equals 5. Notice that there's no more absolute values on there. Let me do the negative situation. The negative situation, and this one's a little bit more tricky. It's the same exact thing as you see here, but you need to multiply the right side of the equation by a -1. So it's going to be the same thing, x plus 2, don't change it to a -2, it's the same thing, x plus 2 equals -5. The only thing that changes is the right side of the equation. So now we have both situations, and now we could move to step 3. Let me actually pull up the steps once again. Step 3 is to solve both and check if you want. And now we'll get back to the if you want part in a little while. But let's solve both. Okay, so I'm going to subtract 2. It's going to cancel. Subtract 2. You're going to end up with x equals 3, and ladies and gentlemen, that is an answer. Let's do the other side. We're going to subtract 2, and subtract 2 cancels. X equals -7, and ladies and gentlemen, x equals -7 is an answer. Now, the check if you want part, we could check if we want. Now, what do I mean by if we want? You don't have to. Now, there are certain times that you're going to have to check it. It says right here, if you have a variable outside the absolute values, what do I mean by variable, like an x or a y or any letter? If it's outside the absolute values, you must check your answers. So, question is, on this one, on the original one, do we have a variable, an x on the outside or an x over here? No, we don't. So we don't have to check it. If you want to, go for it. But I don't have to check it, so I am not going to in this case. Anyhow, let me move on over here to number 4. And number 4 is a great problem. You really want to see a question like this on the test, because when you take a look at the notes, step 1 is to isolate the absolute value, of course. And this one already has an absolute value isolated. There is nothing with the absolute value. So we move on to step 2. Here we go. Move on to step 2, which is set up your positive and negative situations. However, if we take a look down here at these extra notes, it says, and read this carefully, if you have an isolated absolute value, isolated means that the absolute value is by itself, which we do, equaling a negative number. Right here we have an absolute value, isolated, equaling a -4. Then you can stop and just say no solution. Now the thing is this, guys, it's impossible for you to take the absolute value of something and the answer be -4. It's impossible. So right here you could just stop, not even do any work, and just say no solution. Or you could do this symbol, which means no solution. It's like a 0 with a line through it. Okay. Anyhow, let's move on to number, which one are we doing here? Number 5. And number 5, we need to isolate it. That's step 1. So let me divide by -2, cancels, divide by -2. and we're going to have the absolute value of x plus 1 equals positive 4. So it's very important that we isolate the absolute value first, and then work on the positive and negative situation. So there's the positive and the negative situation. I'm running out of space. Wait a minute, I'm not running out of space because it's just a picture. I can just move the picture up and actually do it. Yeah, sorry about that. Let's solve this thing. We're going to subtract 1 and subtract 1. We're going to get x equals 3, and that's an answer. And over here we subtract 1, we're going to get x equals negative 5, and that is an answer. Do I have to check these answers? No, I don't. The only time I do have to check the answers is if I have a variable on the outside of my absolute values. And in this case, I did not have a variable on the outside of the absolute values. So I'm done with that question. Let me give you an example of one that we actually did have a variable on the outside. And period 1, I think I actually did this one incorrectly in class, so please pay attention. So this one here has a variable on the outside. Is it isolated? Yes, it's isolated. So step 1 is done for us. Step 2, which is set up a positive and negative situation. Let's actually do that. Let me zoom in a little more. Let me go positive, pos, and neg. Okay, now the positive situation is writing it exactly the way it is without the sticks. I know that that might throw some of you off because, yeah, your positive situation has this negative 2x in it. Bottom line is you have to write it exactly the way it is. The positive situation, exactly the way it is without the absolute value sticks. So you just erase them, boom, that's your positive situation. How about for the negative situation? It's the same exact thing, but you need to change the sign of the right side of the equation. Or you could think of it as multiplying the negative 2x by negative 1, and you will get x plus 1 equals 2x. So we have both situations. Let's move on to step 3, which is solving. So I notice that I have an x on this side and an x on that side. I need x by itself on one side, not on both sides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this x by subtracting x. It's going to cancel out. What you do to one side, you do to the other. I will have 1, bring down the equal sign. You end up with a minus 3x over here. Now I need to solve for x. I need to get rid of that negative 3, which means I need to divide by negative 3 and divide by negative 3. I will have x equals negative 1/3, okay? And it's probably better to write it as x on the left side equals negative 1/3 on the right side. This is an answer, or at least a possible answer. Moving on to the other one, I'm going to move this x over by subtracting x. It's going to cancel. Subtracting x. I will have 1 equals 1x, or x equals 1. X is already by itself, so this might be another answer. Now, why do I say might be? Because I need to actually check both solutions here. Now, why do I need to check both solutions? Because it says so down here. If you have a variable on the outside of the absolute values, you must check your answers. You might end up with some answers that don't work. So on the original problem, I had an x on the outside of the absolute values, so I need to check it. So what I'm going to do is move this over to the side and check my first answer, negative 1/3, by plugging it in. As you could see, I took the negative 1/3 and plugged it right into this x, and it's right here. So let's work this out. In order to do this inside of the absolute value, let me go over here. In order to do the inside of the absolute value, I need to add those fractions, and I'm going to put the 1 over 1 so I could see the common, or the denominator 3 and 1, and get a common denominator of 3. So the 1/3 is going to stay the same, negative 1/3. And the other one, the plus 1, I'm actually going to change it to 3/3, which is the same thing as plus 1. And on the right side, we have equals. And how do we multiply this number with this fraction? You put it over 1, and then you multiply the top with the top and the bottom with the bottom. So I might as well do the right side right now. A negative times a negative is a positive, and 2 times 1 is 2, and 1 times 3 is 3. Okay, now the left side, let me continue and add negative 1 plus 3. That will be 2 over 3, and it is inside absolute values. And on the right side, we also have 2 over 3. So we know it works because 2/3 does equal 2/3. Now, let's try the other one. But before I jump too far ahead, what does this mean that 2/3 equals 2/3? It means that the answer, x equals -1/3, when you plug it in, it really does give you a true statement. So this answer is absolutely right. This is part of the answers that you need to include on your answer on the quiz or test. Let's check the other answer, x equals 1. So if I go back to my original and I plug in a 1 right here and right here, what will we have? Let me show you. Plugging in this 1 both right here and here, I'll have a 1 right here and a 1 right there. Let's work it out. Now on the inside, I have 1 plus 1. That will be 2, and I still have the absolute values of 2 to work with. We have the equal sign. We know that 2 times 1, -2 times 1 is -2. And we know that this is an impossibility because the absolute value of 2 cannot be -2. So you could just stop right there and say that it does not work. 2 does not equal -2, so it doesn't work. What does that mean? That means that this answer right here is an extraneous solution. So do not include that in your answer. If you do, I'm going to have to actually mark it wrong. I hope this makes sense, and I hope you really understand this video. You might see it on the quiz.